Sometimes there are places that should never be visited, stories that should never be uncovered. And yet, the curiosity, the need to know, drives us forward into the darkness. What happens when the past doesn't stay buried, when the dead refuse to remain silent? Tonight, you'll hear stories of those who ventured too far, too deep into forgotten places, a lift that leads to a world that doesn't exist, letters from beyond the grave, and a hospital that holds more than just memories. There's no turning back. Not once you've crossed the threshold. Stay with me, and let's see where the darkness takes us. Story 1. The House That Rebuilt Itself. Part 1. The Move-In. I never planned to leave the city, but after the promotion fell through, after the breakup, after the nights that stretched into hollow mornings, I needed out. So, when I stumbled across that listing, a sprawling old house on the outskirts of some forgotten town, dirt cheap, I convinced myself it was a fresh start. Or maybe I just wanted to believe it. The house was wrong from the start. It stood at the end of a cracked, weed-choked driveway, its windows like dull, staring eyes. The paint peeled in jagged strips, like skin after a bad sunburn. But it was cheap. Too cheap. The kind of deal that makes your gut twist, but you sign anyway because you want it to be okay. So I did. The first night was quiet. Too quiet. No distant hum of traffic, no neighbors' muffled arguments through thin apartment walls, just the creaks and groans of an old house settling, or something else moving. By midnight, I noticed it. The bedroom window was open. I hadn't opened it. I told myself it was the wind, that old houses do strange things, but the feeling gnawed at me, like the house wasn't just old, it was watching me. I closed the window, locked it. When I woke up the next morning, it was open again. Part 2. The first changes. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I woke up around 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, the room colder than it should have been. The window was open, again. But this time, it wasn't just the window. The door to my bedroom was gone. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest, staring at the bare stretch of wall where the door had been. No seams, no hinges, just smooth, unbroken plaster, like the doorway had never existed at all. For a few seconds, I told myself I was still dreaming. I even pinched my arm hard, but the sharp sting confirmed what I didn't want to believe. I was trapped. I ran to the window, ready to climb out, but when I looked outside, it wasn't outside anymore. Instead of my overgrown yard and the rusted mailbox at the end of the drive, all I saw was a dense, swirling fog pressing against the glass. Shapes moved in that fog, slow, deliberate. I squinted, trying to make out what they were, but the longer I stared, the more the shapes stared back. I stumbled away from the window, gasping for breath. The walls felt like they were closing in, the floorboards groaning under my feet, as if the house was alive, breathing, shifting, and it wasn't finished with me yet. Part 3. Trapped. By the time morning should have come, I realized the sun wasn't rising. I had no idea how long I'd been trapped in that room, but the fog outside never lifted. My phone was dead. The house was silent, except for the occasional groan of wood and the faint sound of something moving behind the walls. I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I woke up, the door was back. But it wasn't the same door. It was taller, narrower, the wood darker like it had been burned. The handle wasn't the brass knob I remembered. It was cold, twisted iron that felt wrong in my hand. But I had no choice. I had to get out. The hallway beyond was unfamiliar, longer than it should have been. The walls were closer together, pressing in like the house had inhaled and wasn't planning to exhale. The wallpaper peeled in jagged strips, revealing something dark beneath, something that pulsed when I touched it. I called out. My voice echoed, but it sounded wrong, like it wasn't just bouncing off the walls, but traveling deeper into the house. And something was listening. I ran. Doors appeared and disappeared as I passed. Windows showed places I didn't recognize, rooms that couldn't exist in my house. I saw myself in one of them, but the reflection didn't move the way I did. It just watched me. The house wasn't letting me go. It was learning me. Part 4. The disappearance. I don't know how long I'd been running. Hours, days. The house had swallowed time the way it swallowed everything else. My legs felt like lead, my breath burned in my chest, but the corridors just kept stretching, twisting deeper into places that shouldn't exist. And then, silence. I stumbled into a room I didn't recognize, but it recognized me. It was empty, except for one thing, a photograph lying in the center of the dusty floor. I picked it up with shaking hands. It was the house, this house, but older, much older. The photo was faded, the edges curled and brittle, like it had been sitting here for decades. But it wasn't the house that made my blood run cold. It was the people standing in front of it, a family of 4, their faces blurred, as if they'd been smudged out of time. But in the far corner, almost out of frame, was a figure I did recognize. It was me. I dropped the photo like it burned. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate. But I didn't turn around. I couldn't, because some part of me already knew. It wasn't someone coming for me. It was the house. The walls began to close in, the floorboards splitting and groaning beneath my feet like the house was breathing me in. I tried to scream, but my voice dissolved into the walls, swallowed whole like everything else. The last thing I saw was my reflection in the window, but it wasn't moving anymore. It was smiling. You clicked on this video. You gave me a shot, even though my channel is small, and for that, I'm beyond grateful. So here's my promise to you. Stick around, and I won't let you down. Got an idea for a new scary story? Be the first to comment, and I'll write the next one exactly how you want it. That's my way of saying thanks. Now turn the lights down, and let's get into it. This is a ride you won't forget. The second story. The elevator to the basement that didn't exist. Part 1. The discovery. It was supposed to be a simple night out, a little urban exploration to kill time. We'd heard rumors about the old office building on the outskirts of town, the one everyone said was haunted. But of course, we didn't believe in ghosts, just old offices and dusty furniture. What we didn't expect was the elevator. We had spent hours wandering the abandoned floors, poking around forgotten desks and peeling wallpaper, the air thick with decay. The place was eerily quiet, like it hadn't been touched in years. But then, at the end of a long hallway, we found it. A metal elevator door that looked older than the rest of the building. The floor plans in the entryway had shown no sign of an elevator, no basement, no -1 floor, nothing. But there it was, the button for the basement glowing faintly in the dim light, waiting for us to press it. "Do you think it works?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would make the elevator disappear. "Only one way to find out," I replied, pressing the button with a nervous laugh. The elevator doors slid open with a sharp clank, revealing a narrow, dimly lit interior. There was no sign of life, no warning signs, No out-of-order notices, just a small, cold space that seemed to beckon us in. As we piled inside, I could feel my heart beat faster. My hand hovered over the button for the basement, and I glanced at my friends. None of us were entirely sure what was waiting for us down there, but curiosity pushed us forward. The elevator jerked to life with a low groan, the kind of sound that makes you question if the thing is going to stop midway and drop you into some forgotten pit. As we descended, I glanced at the display panel. Floor -1. It was the only floor that wasn't listed anywhere in the building's plans. And as the elevator moved deeper into the bowels of the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of our shallow breathing and the low hum of the elevator's machinery. The air grew heavier with each passing floor until, ding, the elevator doors opened. But the basement wasn't empty. It was like stepping into another world. Part 2. The Descent. The doors opened slowly, creaking as if protesting the intrusion. What we saw wasn't what I expected. I thought the basement would be dark, empty, maybe even dangerous. But what we stepped into was alive. The room stretched before us, impossibly large for a basement in a building this old. The walls were lined with strange, rusted pipes and thick electrical cables that seemed to pulse with a low hum. It wasn't the kind of hum you hear from machinery. This was something deeper, something more unnatural. The air felt colder here, the chill wrapping around us like a suffocating blanket. "Is this really the basement?" Mark whispered, his voice faltering. "It doesn't look like the kind of place you'd find under an office building." Sarah nodded, her eyes wide, scanning the dark corners of the room. "I don't like this. Something's not right." We all felt it, the weight of being watched, the quiet presence lingering just beyond our vision. Every now and then, I thought I saw something moving out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, nothing was there. We ventured further into the basement, the buzzing sound of the pipes growing louder, vibrating through the floor beneath us. The further we walked, the more I began to notice that things in the basement didn't add up. There were small doors tucked in corners that led to nothing but walls. A desk sat in the far corner, its surface covered in dust, but somehow untouched, as if someone had just left in a hurry. But the worst part, the smell. It wasn't just old, damp basement air. It smelled wrong, metallic, sour, almost as if something had been rotting in the walls for years. I could feel my stomach turning, but I forced myself to ignore it. We were here to explore, to prove that this was just another old building, nothing to be afraid of. Then I heard it. A faint rustling, followed by a low, almost imperceptible scraping sound. It wasn't the kind of noise the old building made. It was something else. We froze. I looked at my friends, and their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear. It was too quiet now. The hum from the pipes had stopped, and the only sound in the room was the steady thud of our own hearts. Suddenly, the door behind us, the one we'd come through, slammed shut. "Who closed it?" I asked, my voice shaky. No one had moved, but there it was, the door, sealed shut. We were trapped. "Okay, this is getting too weird," Mark said, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the handle. It wouldn't budge. The basement had to be part of the building, right? But the longer I stood there, the less it felt like it belonged to any world we understood. Something was wrong with this place. Something was wrong with us. Part 3. The Watchers. The air in the basement grew heavier, thick with a strange, oppressive weight. We stood there, too afraid to move, but our eyes were drawn to the far corner of the room. There, in the shadows, I saw something. No, someone. A figure, barely visible, standing perfectly still. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, but it was watching us. I could feel its gaze even though I couldn't make out its features. "Do you see that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely a breath. Her face was pale, and I knew she saw it too. Before I could respond, there was a soft click, followed by the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. My stomach twisted. The footsteps were unnervingly quiet, like the person was trying to make no noise at all. Mark grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "We need to get out of here now." But when we turned to head back to the elevator, the path had changed. The layout of the basement had shifted. What had been a wide, open space was now a maze of narrow hallways, each one darker than the last. And in every direction, I felt the eyes on us, watching, waiting. The basement wasn't just abandoned, it was alive. Part 4. The Endless Night. I don't know how long we wandered through the maze of hallways. It felt like hours, maybe days, but the basement was timeless, frozen in its own twisted dimension. Every turn we made led us deeper into the unknown, and the shadows, they followed. Then, it happened. The air grew colder, impossibly cold, as if the very space around us was siphoning the warmth from our bodies. I could see my breath in the air, a pale mist that lingered like a ghost. That's when I noticed it. The hum was back, louder than ever. It wasn't just in the walls now. It was in the floor, the ceiling, the air itself. The sound was all around us, vibrating through our bones, making everything seem wrong. I turned to ask if anyone else heard it, but my words were caught in my throat. Because what I saw, no, what I felt was worse than any sound. There were figures, dozens of them, maybe more, standing just beyond the reach of the dim lights. Their faces were obscured, shadows tangled around them, but I could feel their eyes, cold, hollow, watching. Who are they? Mark's voice trembled, breaking the oppressive silence. I couldn't answer. I wanted to scream, to run, but the basement had changed again. The walls had shifted. We were no longer on the same floor we'd entered. There were no doors, no windows, no way out. Just a long, winding corridor stretching endlessly before us. In the distance, the faintest glow flickered, a dim, sickly green light. As we walked toward it, the glow became clearer. It was an elevator, but this one wasn't like the others. It was different. The doors were cracked open, revealing a pit of blackness, an abyss that seemed to swallow all light. There was a feeling about it, an invitation, like the basement wanted us to step into it. But the thought of going near it, of stepping inside, was enough to send a chill through my entire body. Suddenly, I realized that something was moving behind us, slowly, just out of sight, but getting closer. I dared not turn around, knowing that whatever it was had been following us since the moment we arrived. We had been here for so long. The basement wasn't just some place in a building. It was a place between places, and it was pulling us deeper, never letting go. I could hear footsteps now, closer and closer, and then the whispers, soft, incoherent, like 1,000 voices just beyond the edge of my hearing. But then one word broke through the chaos. "Welcome." A shadow loomed behind me, cold breath on my neck. The others screamed. I turned and found no one there. They were gone. And then I realized I had never left. Letters from the Abandoned Asylum. Part 1. The Mysterious Letters. The first letter arrived on an old, yellowing piece of paper. It was addressed to me, though the sender's name was completely unfamiliar. The handwriting was smudged, as if it had been written in a hurry or perhaps under duress. The message was simple, but chilling. Please help. They are still here, waiting. The letter was signed with a name I recognized, but shouldn't have. Dr. Ethan Holt, a psychiatrist who had died over 20 years ago in a notorious psychiatric institution, now abandoned. At first I thought it was a prank, but then another letter came, this time with a description of the very building, Blackwood Asylum, and strange, unsettling details about its hidden rooms and mysterious occurrences that no one outside the asylum would know. The letter was postmarked from the very town where the asylum stood, a place long avoided by locals due to rumors of death, experiments, and disappearances. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The urge to investigate was irresistible. A part of me knew this wasn't a simple case of a deranged mind reaching out from the grave. There was something about the letters that felt real, too real. That night I packed my things. The letters had made it clear someone needed help, and somehow that someone was asking for mine. Part 2. Entering Blackwood Asylum. I pushed the rusted gates open, the screech of metal scraping against metal echoing in the heavy silence. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of mildew and decay, the scent of a place that had been left to rot for far too long. Blackwood Asylum, once a towering structure of authority and control, now stood as a crumbling monument to madness. The building seemed to absorb the light. The windows were dark, sealed with dust and grime, and the walls looked like they were closing in around me. It was like the very air inside was saturated with a history of pain and suffering, an oppressive, suffocating force that pressed against my chest, making it harder to breathe with each step I took. As I moved deeper into the asylum, the sense of abandonment grew more tangible. The hallways were eerily quiet, save for the sound of my footsteps, which seemed too loud in the silence. My flashlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the peeling walls. There were no signs of life, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The letters had warned of hidden rooms, places where things were kept, but nothing could prepare me for the first glimpse of what lay ahead. At the end of the corridor, I saw the door, slightly ajar, the faintest trace of light spilling from the crack. But it was not light as I knew it. It flickered, like the pulse of a dying heart. I took a step toward the door, and the faintest whisper, a voice too faint to understand, seeped through the cracks. I froze. The coldness in the air intensified, and my heart began to race. Was it my imagination, or was there someone in there? With trembling hands, I pushed the door open. Part 3. The silent room. I stepped into the room, my pulse pounding in my ears. The door creaked shut behind me, and the silence was almost suffocating. My flashlight flickered once, then died completely, plunging me into darkness. The air in the room felt colder, thicker, as if something was pressing against my skin. I had no choice but to keep moving, each footstep echoing in the absolute quiet. The walls were lined with old, yellowing papers and dusty furniture that had once been meticulously arranged, now forgotten, decayed, and abandoned. But it wasn't the room itself that unsettled me. It was the feeling, a presence, like invisible eyes watching me from every corner, suffusing the very air around me. I could feel it in my bones, a pressure in the room so intense it almost made me dizzy. As I moved deeper into the room, I noticed something odd. The floor was covered in strange, dark stains. It wasn't just dirt or age. It looked like something had been spilled there, something viscous, something that hadn't dried in years. I could almost hear the faint sound of dripping water, though I knew there were no pipes or leaks in the walls. Then I saw it. At the far end of the room, under the window, was an old wooden desk. On it lay an envelope, sealed with faded red wax. My name was written across it, no return address. I hadn't received any letter like this, had I? The handwriting was too familiar. It looked like the letters I had received, except this one was here, in front of me. I reached for it, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. As I touched the envelope, the room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped further, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, something long and dark, shifting in the shadowy corners of the room. My heart raced, but I couldn't move, not even to glance at what I had seen. It felt as if the room was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, the whisper came, soft at first, almost imperceptible, but then louder, clearer. A voice, hoarse, strained, hissed from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come here." Part 4. The truth behind the letters. I tore open the envelope, my hands trembling. Inside, there was a single sheet of yellowing paper, covered in that same unsettling handwriting, scratchy and uneven, as though written in a rush, desperate. I felt sick to my stomach just reading it. "You've been here before." The words sent a chill so deep through me that I could hardly breathe. My mind raced. What was this? Had I been here before? I didn't think so. I had never been to this place. The more I stared at the paper, the more the words seemed to blur, like they were shifting, rearranging themselves right before my eyes. And then, with a jolt, the letters changed. "You are not who you think you are." I dropped the paper, my heart hammering. The room felt even colder now, impossibly so, and I realized I couldn't move. My limbs were frozen, my mind screaming for me to run, but I was paralyzed. I turned slowly, eyes darting around the room as the shadows seemed to writhe and shift on their own, their movements too fluid, too deliberate. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, the whispers grew louder. They surrounded me, thickening in the air, pressing against my chest. Each whisper was a phrase, a name. I heard my name, mixed with the voices of people long gone, people from this hospital, people who had died here. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the far corner of the room, stepping from the shadows like it had been waiting. The face was barely visible, but the outlines of a dark, hollow shape, like a person, but not, became clear. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the truth. This wasn't just some asylum. It was my asylum. This was where I had been, where I had disappeared from years ago. I had been part of the people who were kept here, the ones whose names had been erased from memory. I wasn't a journalist trying to uncover the past. I was the past. The figure stepped closer, and I couldn't look away. As it neared, I could make out its features, a familiar, sickly face. My own face, twisted and corrupted, its eyes hollow and dark. I stumbled back, horrified, as it reached toward me. Its fingers were long, skeletal, cold as ice, and the second it touched me, I felt the years of isolation, of torment, flood into me. The whispers, now deafening, filled my head. "You never left. You never escaped." And then everything went dark.